most Russian elites, and certainly the people around Putin, don't view Russia as a normal country that needs to play by, sort of U.S. or Western rules.
So tell me about Moscow X. Tell me a little bit about what's it about.
Yeah, so Moscow X is a story about what it might look like if the CIA got very serious about sticking it to Vladimir Putin. Moscow X is the name of a fictional component of the very real CIA's Russia House that in the novel is charged with taking this very outside-the-box, aggressive approach to dealing with the Russians. It's run by very colorful, slightly deranged, if I may, CIA case officer named Artemis Proctor, who enlists 2 CIA case officers under non-official cover. We call them NOCs, NOCs, who are charged with getting in front of Putin's money man as part of this plot. And they come into contact with the money man, Vadim, who's this fairly despicable character, and his wife, Anna, who is a banker, but also an officer of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, and she's a woman who's really just playing a game all her own. So it's a story, it's a spy novel, so it's a story about modern espionage, and I really am trying to tell a story that is current to the present day, but it's also, hopefully, a story about, all the themes that make espionage fiction great. So, truth and loyalty and betrayal and vengeance set amid the very real shadow war between Washington and Moscow.
Now, of course, the fascinating thing about you, David, is that, you used to work for the CIA. So this becomes something almost sort of written by an insider. It's fiction, of course, but where and how do you draw the line? I've always been fascinated with people who used to work for the sort of the secret services when they come out and they write fiction. Is there some sort of agreement between you and the CIA of areas where you just won't write about?
Well, on my very last day at the CIA, I was led into a room that would recollect the vibes of a broom closet. There was a very old woman in there, and she had a stack of paper, and I was told to sign it. And I did, of course. When you're handed paper there, you tend to sign it. And I stupidly, as I was leaving, asked her if I could have copies, and she laughed at me and sort of said, "You must be joking. You can't take any of this out of the building." But one of those pieces of paper essentially said that from that moment on till the day I'm dead, I will send anything that I'm going to put in print. That could be an op-ed, that could be a novel, that could be a blog post, my resume. I'm going to send that to the CIA for clearance. Now, so there is that mechanism. They're called the Publication Review Board. They review my novels, and if there's anything that is, they deem sensitive, classified, protecting sources and methods, they will literally edit it out with a black highlighter. But I do think that, I have some sense as I'm writing of what is responsible and irresponsible. And I really try as best I can to be conservative about that and to not include information in the novels that is unwise or irresponsible. And so I'm the first line of defense in that. And I like to think I'm doing a relatively effective job at that.
Now, in the book, you've referred to her already, Artemis Aphrodite Proctor, who is the station chief in Moscow. And I know I don't think I'm giving too much away here because it happens in the first few pages, but she sort of dishes out some pretty harsh violence with a couple of bottles, one a bottle of vodka, and another a bottle of horse milk, I believe, to take out an opponent. How much violence do station chiefs actually have to deal with in the real world? I don't know if you can even answer that.
Well, let me say this: it's not the norm. Okay, I mean, I think, although I will say that scene is a composite of different stories I have heard from case officers, chiefs of station. So most of the events of that scene, in some form or fashion, have happened. Just to put that out there, which is sort of in and of itself kind of insane.
So someone somewhere has taken someone out with a vodka bottle and a bottle of horse milk.
So let me, I'm not sure if the liquid was horse milk. I just wanted to do that. But there
Good.
have been...
I'm glad you did.
unpleasant incidents. I will say though that contrary, any good spy novel generally is going to have some. The stakes need to be high, and in many of these stories, there is violence, car chases, that kind of stuff. There's sort of tropes of the genre. Um, the actual job tends to be, and I think there's characters in the book that reference this throughout, tends to be a lot more about interpersonal dynamics, developing relationships, paperwork, typing out cables, the kinds of things that don't necessarily immediately lend themselves to a gripping narrative. And so, I think in my books I try to blend those two things so that you have some of the insider bureaucratic procedural views of the world, and of the espionage business, but also occasionally someone gets hit over the head with a bottle of horse milk to kind of keep things moving.
What would you say, because of course the CIA features in so many bits of media and film and TV and books, what would you say are the most sort of not contested, but the cliches that we sort of accept, but that are just simply not true in the life of a CIA intelligence officer like you were? What would you say are the biggest sort of, when you watch them, you kind of go, nah, that's just not true?
Yeah. Well, a couple that jump immediately to mind, people being armed, having weapons. That might have been the case in some war zone experiences in Afghanistan or Iraq, depending on the sort of the specific context of the asset that's being handled and where they're being handled. But it's very uncommon in general for intelligence officers to be like walking around, especially case officers, right, to be walking around with weaponry. Very, very uncommon. I would say car chases. You see these in many different spy and military thrillers, and they're obviously quite fun to watch. They don't happen. Really, very, very, very uncommon. And I will say this featured in Damascus Station, my first novel. And it happens, but it's very uncommon. But a common trope would be, a case officer, recruiting officer, and an asset falling in love, being in a romantic relationship. That is a fun theme to work with because you've got so much potential energy there. You've got these two people collaborating on some matter of geopolitical importance, and they also happen to be in love. Well, that's as a writer, that's fantastic. Does it happen in real life? Not really. I can think of a few cases, but it's not common at all.
Let me ask you about the book, Moscow X. Now, you finished that as Russia invaded Ukraine. You already talked about the fact that Putin is a sort of a major part of the book. Did that mean that you had to sort of go back to the manuscript and make some changes? Did it change the story much for you?
It did. It did. I was putting the final touches, as you mentioned, on the first draft, more or less, when it became clear, kind of December of 21, January of 22, that this was going to happen. And I did have to make some changes. The big portions of the book take place in St. Petersburg and in Moscow. There are Russian characters I'm trying to render to not be cartoons. And so, I had to sort of recast significant swaths of the book to make clear that the war is sort of a backdrop to the story. The novel's not about the war in Ukraine by any stretch, but I didn't feel like I could write a spy novel set in Russia without sort of casting that shadow over the entire narrative. I would also say that to get to this CIA plot to make Putin believe, the centerpiece of the novel is really this plot to make Vladimir Putin believe that a coup is underway when one is in fact not. And after the invasion, or sort of the proper invasion, because it had been going on since 2014, I felt like I could skip some of the things that I had in earlier drafts that got the CIA to that point where they would approve this operation, and I could just get on with it because of what was really going on in the world and the context that most readers would be reading the book in. So it was, I think it did have a streamlining effect on the story, which I'm appreciative of. But, it was, as a writer, to watch these events unfolding, you kind of hope the world freezes for a little bit to just let you finish writing the book, and it didn't work out that way.
What do you think the West fundamentally misunderstands about Russia, if indeed anything? Because we are always almost surprised, taken aback, dealing with Russian behavior, mainly because of the Russian president. But do you think that, security services such as the CIA have a good handle on Russia, or have we misunderstood the way Russia functions?
I think that there has been, which I think we're in the process of correcting this. Mm-hmm. But my view would be that we in general had a belief that was, I think, prominent inside our security services, inside our political parties, inside a lot of academia and think tanks, not with everybody, but it was very prominent, that as when the Soviet Union collapsed, as Russia was sort of reeling through the 90s, weak, internally divided, chaotic politics, that this country would sort of, as it resurrected itself, it would do so as a democracy, as a participant in a U.S.-led global order and power structure where we would largely dictate the terms and Russia would sort of accept it and become a normal country. And I think that view has been a fundamental mistake in reading Putin and the people around him who started to make this regime in the early 2000s. And a fundamental misreading of, sort of Russian history and the fact that most Russian elites, and certainly the people around Putin, don't view Russia as a normal country that needs to play by, sort of U.S. or Western rules, and that their power and influence should exceed their borders. And why should they play a game that we've created? So I think there was a fundamental misreading of Russia in that sense that contributed to a lot of the non-response to Putin's, sort of aggression in his near abroad, going back to, the mid-2000s.
Now, look, David, just a couple more questions for you. You mentioned you were stationed in Damascus. You've spent a lot of time in the Middle East, Syria specifically. Just having a look at what's going on there at the moment, are you worried, someone who sort of knows how the whole Middle East sits together, how delicate the situation is there? What do you make of it?
Yeah, I'm very worried. I think we're already in a low-grade regional conflict, insofar as it's important to kind of put a word on that. We're not at risk of one, we're in one. It's just the question of how bad it's going to get. And I don't see... I see a lot of different players who, none of whom have an interest in some kind of massive, chaotic, and destabilizing conflict, but also none of whom have an interest in sort of fully, bringing tension down. Everyone wants to get something, but they want to avoid that bigger conflict. I think that goes for Iran, that goes for many members of its so-called resistance axis, the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Assad regime in Syria, and then you have maximalists, I think, in Israeli politics and in Hamas, who view this conflict as being helpful in many respects to their longer-term aspirations. So I don't see a lot of off-ramps for it. I think, the sort of external powers have sometimes helped to manage this system. The U.S. did that, I think, to some degree in the 90s with helping to manage a peace process that seemed like it was going to create an off-ramp to some of this stuff that's now totally gone. So the prospects for external powers tend to feed these conflicts now as opposed to help tamp them down. So, when I look at this sort of chessboard, I don't see a lot of opportunities for stability, right? I think I see a lot of places, a lot of surface area where there's tension and real high probability of miscalculation, and these sort of classic security spirals where one side's deterrence is the other side's aggression, and you sort of just go from there.
And look, final question, David. You've been so generous with your time. Big year for the US this year, and in the UK. Big elections coming up. Donald Trump has a chance of returning to the White House. What would a second Trump presidency mean for the intelligence services in the US? And in a year like this, do the intelligence services like the CIA knock it up a notch just to make sure to protect the integrity of those elections?
Well, let me take the latter question first. I think, obviously any kind of intelligence the CIA is gathering from outside the country about foreign powers thinking about meddling in elections or trying to destabilize any aspect of the electoral system are taken, extremely seriously and watched closely. We collaborate with the FBI, and law enforcement on that stuff where appropriate. I think that the CIA is, of many of our national security institutions or executive branch institutions, tends to be one of the most apolitical. There's only two roles at the agency that are political appointees, the director and the deputy director, and it is a professionalized bureaucracy that is largely concerned with just keeping on doing its job. So I think in an election year, otherwise, the agency steps forward, they brief both candidates, when the time is right, and it's a highly professional place. So I would just say that I think politicization of these agencies is a real concern, because them doing CIA doing its job depends on it remaining apolitical and providing real objective, non-value laden apolitical analysis to the president. So I think that is going to remain important going forward.
David, thank you so much. You've been so generous with your time. The book is gripping. It is a brilliant read. And thank you for joining us.